Welcome everyone to the Preschool Neuroscience Summit. Today we're very lucky to have Dr. Sarah McKay with us. She is an Oxford University educated neuroscientist, an educator, a presenter, and the director of the Neuroscience Academy. She's also the author of the Women's Brain book, and she teaches coaches and therapists and teachers all over the world about neuroscience and how they can use this knowledge to improve their work and their lives. So welcome, Sarah, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a privilege to be able to speak to you. So thank you for the invitation.
Thanks so much. So if just before we start, we'll have all of Dr. McKay's links to all of her website and her book, and she also has a free 10-day neuroscience course, so that would be a great thing to sign up for, and also highly recommend her TED Talk, which is a great thing just to watch to get an overview kind of what she's doing in some areas of her work. So Sarah, before we start, can you just maybe tell us a little bit about what kind of work you're doing at the moment, and an overview of kind of the latest developments in neuroscience that might apply to parents and teachers?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It is my life's great passion and my great indulgence is to talk about neuroscience and the brain, and in particular brain development, because that's really, that was the focus of my PhD research. I was very interested in those very first few postnatal weeks and months after birth, and that was the topic of my PhD thesis. Kind of how do the connections in the brain, how do the neurons in the brain wire up? Why does one synapse form and another doesn't? And I really kind of approach that rather naively now from the perspective of, is it nature nurture? Is it completely guided by genes? Is it completely innate? Or is that wiring determined by experience? And certainly, I feel myself a little embarrassed now, but that was sort of 20 years ago. But what my work did show in my thesis work, and also what we really know now, is it's not really a nature or nurture question. There's no or there. It's the two work together and are deeply entwined and almost inform each other. So they're almost so woven together we can't separate them out. So I suppose in a way, thank goodness that was what the data from my research project showed, that the two work together. I stayed in academia after I finished my PhD for about 5 or 6 years, but then became very, I had, I suppose, what we would now call FOMO.
Right.
10 years ago, 12 years ago, that word didn't exist, right? And it's funny because when we learn new words to describe emotional experiences, we understand what they are. And then I didn't know that was what I was experiencing. Actually, I was writing a little bit about this concept today, that when we learn a new word to describe an emotion, we're more likely to experience that emotion in the future. But I was experiencing what we would now call FOMO, and that as you go through your academic research career, you're by virtue of research and science, you have to become very expert in one narrow field. And I really missed learning about all of the different aspects of neuroscience that were out there to learn, because it's this incredibly broad and deep, rich discipline. And so I sort of agonized for about 5 or 6 years over sort of moving out of academic research and moving more into communications and education, whereby I could kind of connect the dots between different ideas and take what we knew from the research lab and share with the world, and share what we can do and what we can use, useful tools that are sort of now arising from the work of, the years and many hundreds of thousands of neuroscientists that have worked in the discipline. As I say, my research when I was in the lab was very much focused on brain development, and the word that we now commonly use that we didn't use back then, it's interesting how language evolves, was this word neuroplasticity. And I remember the very first time I heard it spoken, must have been around 1999. And it wasn't a word that we use very commonly in the lab, but it's become such a a word that we all kind of understand, particularly people who would be attending this summit and doing the work that your audience would be doing. And I'm still fascinated and interested in that, and really love teaching people about these ideas. What we understand about how little brains grow and change and develop in those first few years in childhood, how they continue to grow and shape and be changed and sculpted by experience all the way through the schooling years. And then, that kind of default natural ability to learn and grow and change does kind of start to wind down the older we get. But of course, in adulthood, there are still things that we can do to promote brain health and plasticity and behaviour change. But of course, it does get a whole lot harder. And that's why little people are wonderful creatures to work with, because they almost learn by default. And for me, understanding the biology behind that's this is really interesting.
Wow.
But that's what I do, and I write books, and I present, and I don't travel and speak at the moment because it's 2020, but I teach online courses and really just try and make neuroscience useful for people who work with humans.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, isn't it? To share that practical knowledge of what people can actually take from all this research that's happening and apply to their own lives. So tell us a little bit, we're in the middle of COVID right now, so there's a big change in the world, but tell us a little bit about how we as adults, as parents, as teachers, what are kind of your top tips of how to keep our brain healthy and feeling safe during this time and just normally, so that we impact the children that we're working with in a positive way?
Yeah, that is such a good question, because I think we've all been just thrown into a complete tailspin, and we're talking now, and what are we in June, mid-June? It feels like, can you even remember the beginning of March? It seems like it was another lifetime ago, because so much has changed, but in a way we haven't gone anywhere. We've all been we've stopped, but everything's changed. And it's interesting to watch how we've adapted in some ways. Even in the past few months, I think it just does show. It's just been so tough, and everyone, we were sharing stories before we got on here about everyone's got a different story and a different struggle and a different heartbreak, but little moments of pleasure and joy that they've found in all of this. And it's interesting just to even see how we've kind of adapted between March and June, which I do think is testimony to the resilience of humans. If I look back though, and I suppose we're still in different ways, we've got different questions. A big topic in all of this has been this idea of uncertainty. And from a neuroscience perspective, if we look at what our brains do, they essentially evolved as what we call in neuroscience prediction machines. So what they do is they're predicting all of our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviours are essentially emerging based on what our brain thinks is about to happen next. And our brain's very good at kind of making a guess and filling in the gap. But suddenly we're in this world where we literally do not know what is always going to be happening next. And especially in the first few months of lockdown globally, no one knew what was happening. All of our goals, all of our plans, all of our strategies, everything that we knew that was going to be happening in the next few hours and days and weeks and months and years, I say the goalposts didn't just shift, they just vanished. And when we're faced with uncertainty and with the unknown, well, our brain doesn't kind of know what to do next. And that is really the root of a lot of our fears and anxieties is the unknown, is uncertainty. And in the kind of the neuroscience world and psychology kind of worlds, we would call that, facing uncertainty. And we've all got a different degree or a different level or tolerance to uncertainty. Some people are really great at not knowing what's happening next, and they don't really kind of mind, and they're happy to carry on. We can learn a lot about what people who are like that do. But many of us just do not like not knowing what is coming next, and where the worry is. We're the ones who feel anxious, we're the ones that feel afraid when we don't know what we're meant to be doing in the next hour and the next week and the day, next month, next year, and we can't find answers. Early on, none of us knew, are schools open, are they closed, how long are kids going to be off, are we going to be able to travel, am I going to be safe, is my family going to be safe, am I going to, is my health at risk? No one knew any answers. And when we don't know, then we fill those gaps with the stories in our own head. And sometimes they can be useful, but most often they just sort of send us in a bit of an anxious kind of worrying tailspin. So I think it's useful to look at who are the people who are very tolerant in these times, and what do they do. We can look at people who are naturally like that. We can also look at people who are trained to cope in those sort of situations. We could look towards the military. We could look towards someone like an airline pilot. We can look towards what we understand from resilience research in the neurosciences, is that people don't typically rise to the challenge. People fall back on systems and processes. And one thing that you may have heard of, and that I was certainly sharing with people, was in the face of uncertainty, when every plan that we've had has vanished, you have to bring your focus back in as close as you safely can. That may just be your immediate family in your house, and build in some structures and some systems and some routines and some timetables. So you're placing almost kind of a framework of certainty in front of you, even if it is, I'm going to get up every day at the same time. This is what we're having for breakfast. Then for the first half an hour after breakfast, we're going to tidy up as a family, and then we're going to sit down and we're going to read, and then half an hour later we're going to have a break, and maybe we'll cut up some apples for lunch, and come up with a very detailed plan, because then you're removing uncertainty from your immediate, day to day, and it gives you just a foundation, something to kind of cling on to almost. And so that's one of the most important things I think that people haven't already done to find a way to do. And we also find when people are in these situations, it's very easy to spiral down emotionally, because you're not looking forward and reaching goals and making plans. And so your reward pathways in your brain almost get a bit dulled. And we know people who are anxious and worried and uncertain and don't have a plan aren't reaching goals, and it becomes very easy to lose the ability to feel pleasure. So that is essentially sort of starting down towards the path of depressed emotions. So what can you embed in that timetable and that structure, some kind of things to look forward to, even if it's something little. So what I did was, I'm on 1,000-piece puzzle, like a jigsaw puzzle number 5 or 6 or something since we went into lockdown in March, because I just love a jigsaw puzzle. I do it every single morning, get the kids off to school. We're in Australia, so my kids have gone back to school, sit down with my coffee and a podcast, and I do my jigsaw puzzle. And I've got like 1,000 little opportunities there to give myself a little pat in the back, a little reward. Silly little thing, but it's something I look forward to every day. It's rewarding, it's a simple pleasure, and it's just become a really important part of my routine. So it's little things like this. And then the other thing I think that's fundamental to us at any point in any time in our life, whether we know exactly what's happening, there's no COVID, we're all certain everything is going well in our lives, and that is to get outside and move our bodies. If we can't get outside, move our bodies inside. And that's exercise, I suppose you could call it, but not necessarily just exercise for the sake of physical fitness, which we all know is vitally important. But when we exercise, when we move our bodies, we're reminding our brains we retain agency. We're reminding ourselves we have a choice still. It may just be the choice to be able to walk down that street and turn left or right. It's just reminding your body that you can still move yourself through space. You can still make decisions. You still have a sense of control. And again, you've got the physical fitness, but you're also kind of tapping in again to that same sort of sense of self. Everything is okay. I am safe. I am here. I have a plan. I can still make choices. There's really 3 little things there that I think for me have been vitally important for my mental health and well-being, drawn from neuroscience as well, and some things that I think perhaps all adults can be think about implementing within their day.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for those very practical ideas. I love everything that you said. Can you talk a little bit about maybe mirror neurons and how, when, as you were saying, maybe when we're spiraling or we're over worrying about things, does that affect the children that we're in contact with on a daily basis, or maybe teachers doing online learning if kids aren't back to school?
Yeah, look, I think I can just hear one of my kids shouting now as we're saying this. Apologies for that. Look, I think and did you mention mirror neurons in particular? Yeah, I think mirror neurons are a bit of one of these ideas that are perhaps a bit, people have made a bit more of them than what we necessarily think they are in lots of ways in neuroscience. And when I kind of talk about interactions and social interactions, I try not to be too super reductionist and essentialist when it comes down to this neuron does this and where in the brain does that happen. I think it's kind of useful to think about, I talked about our brains being prediction machines, but our brains are also kind of social networks. And from the moment we're born, I mean, you could feed a child and make sure the child has its nappy changed and it's, got somewhere comfortable to sleep. But I mean, a robot could do that, but that doesn't mean that that child's going to be loved and nurtured and interacted with. And we know that a child needs that sort of social interaction as much as it needs just the basics of being kept alive. And we have incredibly sad evidence for that. For example, people will be quite familiar with the stories of Romanian children in orphanages from kind of back in the early 90s, when kind of the Iron Curtain went down, and they went and they found all these kids being kept alive in orphanages, but they weren't really given any love or attention or interaction. And those children have kind of carried that, and we could say brain damage through with them, through they're all now kind of in their late 20s and 30s, and have been reasonably damaged by the fact that whilst they were kept alive, they didn't have that love and connection and interaction that our little social brains require. There's a whole lot more kind of going on in what the brain kind of needs and requires than simply mirror neurons, which are a concept which comes out of neuroscience, but it's really about and we know that they exist in monkeys. We don't really know whether they exist in humans. We assume they do. That my brain would, neurons in my brain would fire when I see you performing an action that I'm kind of imagining. There's a whole lot more kind of going on when we are looking and interacting and talking and communicating with other humans. We call it one way, really useful way to kind of think about it as serve and turn interactions. So when an adult is interacting with a baby in a really engaged, or a toddler in a really engaged way, and they're having a conversation and they're teaching that child things, and where the child points over there and the adult looks over there and they view the same object and they talk about it, and there's a real kind of back and forward kind of ping-ponging. There's the use of words. We're teaching language. We're teaching them how to regulate their emotions. We're reacting and responding to them. There's a whole lot of brain networks involved in that, whole lot of brain networks involved in that kind of social brain network development. Little kids kind of almost by default know that that's what they need, and they always kind of demand that of us. They're cute, they're interactive, and when they are interacting with us, especially when they're really little, it's almost like they're asking us for what they need, and they need us to be interacting with them to help all of their brains develop and grow, so it's not just so much about those mirror neurons. And we see that as adults, and we've seen how hard it has been for so many people of every single age to be when we're sort of, socially isolated and we're missing out on that kind of natural interaction that we are kind of doing our very best to do via screens. But, it's kind of the situation that we've found ourselves in at the moment. But I mean, I think in terms of childhood development, but particularly preschool development, having really warm, nurturing, supportive relationships, and when adults model those relationships to children, that is one of the kind of the keys that children's brains need when they're developing. Develops these social brain networks, not just these one or two little mirror neurons that are in there.
Yeah, right. Thanks for sharing all of that. So let's talk a little bit more about the preschool brain and how it develops. And what would you say, I mean, you mentioned a few things, but what would you say are maybe some of the most important things that teachers need to be aware of when they're kind of in a classroom with 20 or 30 young children? Are there any kind of strategies or things that might be important for them to be aware of? I think we talked before about there's often not or very little training in teacher training about the brain and neuroscience.
I do think that teachers are very good at knowing what children need. So I would just caveat my response by saying I'm a neuroscientist and I'm an expert on the brain. Preschool teachers are highly skilled professionals who are experts on children and what children need. I think what neuroscience, certainly from my perspective, what neuroscience can often do is kind of give a little bit of the kind of the biological mechanisms underlying how and why what they do is important. And maybe sometimes it might give some insights into new and different ways to do that. But a lot of the time, preschool teachers are already kind of doing all of the right things. A really highly trained, good preschool teacher is going to be doing what I just said. They're going to be practicing those kind of serve and return interactions. They're going to be, the manager of a childcare centre is going to be identifying and getting the right staff in and training them up. So, they understand how important it is for them to interact with the child and, not just teach them, but, that social side. I think kind of besides those sort of supportive, responsive relationships, fundamental to child development, there's probably two others. I think one would be just around building a lot of those kind of core life skills in terms of what we would call in the neurosciences, and I don't know whether you use it in teaching, that kind of executive function. Teaching children how to learn, teaching children how to take turns, teaching children, colours, numbers, but those kinds of skills around planning and decision making, but doing that in a really age appropriate way. Little brains kind of know that, a bit like they know they need social interaction, they kind of know that they need to do that. And that's what children do when they play. They're exploring the world in a way that promotes healthy brain development. And if they're in a classroom that gives them plenty of time to be curious and to experiment and to have lots of really enriching experiences in a safe, healthy environment, then the children kind of are naturally going to behave in the way that they're required to behave for their brains to develop. So as a neuroscientist, all I can kind of come in and say is, hey, you're doing the right things. This is kind of why, because those are the pathways in the brain which are the most plastic, which are going through that really sensitive, phase in development. That's when they need those particular experiences. We're pretty quite familiar with it when we think about learning language. We know that children need to hear spoken language and to be spoken to kind of, between the ages of 6 months and sort of 2.5 years for them to naturally learn language. And they kind of just learn how to speak their native tongue or whatever languages they're spoken to almost by default. They just effortlessly absorb that because that's the part of the brain which is going through that exquisite phase of development. If they've never heard a language and they hear it for the first time at ages kind of 12, 13, 14, the struggle to learn that language is real. It's not effortless like it is when their little brains are plastic. So there's all of these other skills that they're kind of learning at that point in time. And they're naturally curious, they're natural explorers, they're naturally inquisitive, they're natural experimenters. So they again, almost kind of know what to do. We just need to provide that safe, nurturing environment in which they can do that. I think perhaps the one thing that we need to consider in the classroom, also in the home, and particularly right now, is to think about how we can reduce damaging stress in children's lives. And now is an incredibly stressful time, and the kids will be picking that up depending on how stressed the people are around them. I think it's probably important not to catastrophize stressful experiences, but it's probably important to recognize them. When we look at brain development and we look at kind of body development and all of the systems that are taking place in developing, from conception all the way through to kind of the teenage years, we look and see when are the stress response systems in the body and the brain, how are they kind of developing? And rather, like I said, the brain has the sensitive period for development of language. It has a sensitive period for the development of stress responses, particularly in the first couple of years of life, particularly almost in those pre-verbal years. And you'll probably have kids who might even be in that kind of classroom environment and childcare at that age. And if you think maybe back to your high school biology lessons, and you'd learn about animals kind of adapting to live in the environment in which they're born into. So, a polar bear is white and it's fluffy, so it's camouflaged in the snow and it sort of stays warm. And a penguin living in the South Pole has got feathers and can kind of stay warm, but it's designed to be able to swim under the water. So, these different animals have adapted to live in different environments. Well, humans live all over the planet. And one thing that we're very good at is also adapting to the environment in which we are born into. And if a child is born into an incredibly stressful environment, in those first couple of years of life, their stress response system kind of develops almost at this kind of hyped up level. And it thinks, well, this is the kind of the world I'm born into. It's incredibly stressful. Everyone around me is incredibly stressful. No one's teaching me how to manage my stress response. No one's managing their stress response. Well, I guess stressed out is how life is. And then that child's stress response system has only learned to be super stressed, to be on the alert, to be very, very hyped up. And then that child will then kind of carry that through with them because it was going through that critical period of development. So I think it's really important to reflect and understand that little brains, especially in those first few years of life, are very, very, very sensitive to stress. We might think that they might not remember it, but their brains and their bodies were absorbing that. It's probably quite important to differentiate between different levels of stress, because a little bit of stress is required for healthy brain and body development. And so a little bit of good positive stress might be learning how to separate from mum, maybe going to preschool for the first time, maybe having to interact with some new children that you've never interacted with before, maybe being challenged to learn something new. Children who are a little bit older in primary school, maybe doing a spelling test. That's all good stress. We all need that. That helps build resilience. The kind of stress that we don't want is that kind of super toxic stress that comes from a chaotic environment, perhaps from extreme neglect, perhaps from a natural disaster, perhaps even from something like COVID, in which that stress is experienced in an environment where the adults around that child aren't teaching them how to bring the stress response system down. They aren't responding and interacting with the child and keeping the child calm, or perhaps the adults aren't modelling how to bring the stress down as well. So we can have a little bit of stress, we can have extreme stress, but that extreme stress can be buffered if the adults around that child help manage the situation appropriately. So that'd be the three things I think are most important, would be those kind of serve and turn communication skills, that kind of fostering curiosity and play and exploration, and also finding ways to make sure that the child learns how to deal with stressful situations.
Yeah, thank you. Very useful and important information there. So, Sarah, just when talking about stressful situations, many preschoolers they seem to be the first ones going back to school in a lot of countries, and obviously with lots, it will be a very different environment than before they went. They have to socially distance, and how do you do that with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds who naturally want to have that human connection, and people wearing masks and all this kind of thing. How can what are some of the ways you think that teachers can make that feel safer for children, because it must be quite scary, I would think, for a young child.
I find it really disappointing and uncomfortable to hear that, because I know here in Australia, certainly our public health advice has been that the virus isn't spread amongst children, and especially very, very young children in primary schools and daycares, that the spread comes between adults to adults. The spread doesn't really go between adults to kids and between children. So the use of masks and interacting with little people, to me, just seems like a really difficult situation to put little people in. And obviously we can't socially distance from little children because we have to be touching them and interacting. We need to be changing their nappies. We need to be feeding them. We need to be helping them. So for me, I feel conflicted answering that in a way, because here in Australia, and it's really, you know, like I say, you've got to kind of manage and think about what you can. Our public health advice has not been that children should be socially distancing in schools and nurseries, and that masks should be worn when the parents are interacting with them. So that sort of aside, you know, I think that within the bounds of safety, it's kind of falls on the adults to be doing their absolute best to be normalizing these experiences, not saying you know, wearing a mask is normal, but finding ways around that so that they can still make those children feel safe. They can interact with those children in that same way that they can, if the children are stressed, to be responding to that stress and finding ways to calm the child down. It's completely normal to respond to stress and to get freaked out and to get upset and to feel scared. But what we want to be able to teach little people and model to them how to bring that back down. If we've got adults in those environments who don't know how to do that for themselves and how to teach children how to do that, then we need to be providing that kind of training and those resources in there for those adults, because you're going to have adults in there who are stressed out, and I'm using stressed here in a very loose way, who are scared, who are unsure, who are going to need to be given the right kind of information about, well, what are you going to do if you've got a child who's really scared or unsure. I find that, and I completely understand why in many parts of the world masks are really important and vital. I'm not sure what the health regulations are in terms of them being a requirement, and especially preschool care and interacting. It's going to vary like where you live in the world, to be perfectly honest, that kind of advice. But I mean, it's tough, but these kids get one chance at these years, and they will carry that through with them if it is not managed in the right way. There's a researcher in New Zealand called Richie Poulton, who heads up a longitudinal study which has followed the lives of over 1,000 people who were born in Dunedin in New Zealand back in the kind of the mid-70s. They're in their sort of mid to late 40s now, and they can kind of see the effects of what happens in your early years playing out later in life. And he says, you know, he could predict you know, who's going to end up in prison and who's going to have a much more tumultuous adulthood based on a lot of the things that happen in their early childhood. And as he said to me, we've underestimated the importance of childhood. We absolutely have. We can't assume they will be right. We've got one chance at getting it right now, because that is going to be far easier to do than pick up the pieces later on, the older and older and older they get. And that is because of brain plasticity. That is because their little brains are just learning to grow and be part of a world in which they think that brain is going, well, it's just kind of how it is. So this is how I will therefore set myself up to be for life. So we've got to kind of make sure that we manage that very, very thoughtfully and carefully.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing all those important points. I think they're going to be really helpful for our audience as we kind of navigate this time in history for ourselves and for the little people that we work with. So thank you again, Sarah, for coming on and for sharing all those wonderful tips with us, and the science behind what's happening in our brains. I just want to remind everyone, you can join Sarah's 10-day neuroscience course, and she has loads of online courses and different resources on her website to learn more about how our brains work. So thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with everyone. So everyone stay safe and keep those little people happy.
Yeah.
Give them all the love they need. That's the main thing.
Right. Thank you.